Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for my LCK Cup 2025 playoffs. I guess round number 3 overview and analysis video. However you want to classify this, this is winners finals. This is our first lower bracket series of the entire playoffs. We are going to know quite a bit by the end of this. Of course, the top 3 teams are going to be confirmed, as the team that gets 4th place will be losing their matchup later on in the video here today. But we are also going to know our first team to officially qualify for grand finals here in the LCK Cup, in the LCK Winter Split. So a lot on the line in both of these series, either getting to the finals or surviving in the tournament at all, and I'm excited to go over it. If you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you think was going to happen in both of the series that we were going to cover today, and did it go to your expectations? Did these players live up to the hype that you gave them or the hatred that you gave them, and are you surprised by the outcome of either of these series? Obviously, we will be talking about all of that in this video, but I always love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on the playoffs up until this point, you can check out the round 1 and round 2 videos up in the iCard, as well as the rest of the LCK Cup videos that I've made over the course of this entire year. The playlist will be linked up there, but of course today we're going to be going over this third round, this third, I guess, run through of series, and like I said, we're going to know quite a bit. So without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of these series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will be talking about the updated bracket at the end. Only 3 teams will be remaining by the end of this video. 1 team will be in finals. We will know our semifinals matchup, and a lot's going to be determined. You know, first stand is really right around the corner, so getting into good form right now is more important than it has been all year long. I'm so excited, and I don't want to waste too much time. We've got a lot of games to cover if you followed the LCK in today's video, so let's jump right into our first series, and that's going to be winners finals. We're going to be kicking it off with arguably the more important of these two. The winner of this series automatically goes to grand finals, only has to win 1 more series in order to make the first stand tournament to be the first LCK champion of the year. So a lot on the line for these two teams, and they're certainly coming from different paths, different avenues. It's the number 1 seeded Dplus Kia taking on the number 5 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Obviously, these two teams are very much kind of diametrically opposed in terms of the ways that they have gotten here. DK having won the winners group in the group stage, won Group Elder, and, you know, gone undefeated and got that number 1 seed coming into the playoffs. They got a really easy draw in terms of their round 2 matchup against Nongshim, because that team kind of shockingly, I guess sort of shockingly, upset KT Rolster and got into the top 4. DK had basically no trouble dispatching them, but this team has run into basically no resistance all year long up until this point. Their regular season, they kind of coasted through. They beat T1, they beat Hanwha Life, and outside of that, there really wasn't a lot of competition. You could argue they only played the other 3 worst teams in the league, and so, you know, DK has definitely not exactly been tested in the same way that HLE has, but the reason that they haven't been tested is because they continuously come out on top in every situation that they have been given. Obliterating Nongshim definitely gave me the confidence that this team is who they say they are and is who they have played like they are at the beginning of this year. But again, the big concern for them has been that they've not really, you know, played a best of 5 with gigantic stakes just yet, and even then, they kind of lost the momentum, and they took their eye off the prize a little bit in that Nongshim series by dropping that game number 3 where they definitely didn't need to. They definitely could have swept Nongshim. They just weren't really trying throughout that series. It definitely showcases the fun narrative that this team has, where it's clear that they are just kind of trying to go out there and do all the things that they want to do, but some inconsistency definitely crept up in my mind because of that. That being said, they still are the favorites by a lot going into the series, in my opinion, not only because they've already beaten Hanwha Life, but because they really have not looked challenged at all over the course of this split up until this point. Basically, everybody has looked as good as you could possibly ask for. And for HLE, it's kind of been the opposite trajectory. This team actually was coming out of the group stage with a few question marks. They were winning games, but they weren't winning them dominantly, and they were losing a lot more games than they normally did. They lost to Dplus Kia, which at the time was an upset. They lost to Gen.G in a best of 3. Like, these weren't exactly ideal outcomes for HLE. They had to go through the play-in stage in order to make the playoffs in the first place. Obviously, that wasn't particularly difficult. They end up dispatching DRX to make it in, but the road does not get easier. They have to play basically a qualifier series to even get into the double eliminations part of this bracket. They end up just narrowly beating out T1 in a best of 5. They have to go on to play Gen.G then in a best of 5, and they narrowly in 5 games beat them. They've already played 10 games across 2 series. This team is, very warm, we'll just say, in terms of the experience that they've been able to generate so far in the LCK Cup, but that could prove to be an advantage. This team has played more games than anybody else in the LCK so far in 2025, and it's not really all that close, and that could give them a small advantage of just having a lot more stage experience. Add on to the fact that you have a lot of players on this team that are kind of notoriously big game players. Zeka obviously is the first one that comes to mind, but players like Viper and Zeus have rightfully developed reputations of being able to show up in really critical moments, and you certainly can't count out Hanwha Life Esports. Like, DK is a very good team, but, on paper, they're still a beatable team. You would still expect them to be, kind of challenged by the other top teams in the LCK. And Hanwha Life on paper maybe even has a better roster, and they're in great form right now, coming off of the T1 win, coming off of the Gen.G win. So a lot pointing in favor of HLE, but even more, in my opinion, pointing in favor of DK. I don't want to make it seem like I'm predicting Hanwha Life to win this series. I do think they are an interesting conversation. If they had beaten DK, or at least made it a little bit closer against DK in the group stage, I probably would consider them more in terms of like a 50-50 in this matchup. But at least for now, with how things have gone so far in 2025, you just cannot bet against Damwon against Dplus Kia, until they have proven that they are going to lose. Like, they have not proven at any point that they even can lose against these teams so far this year, as they've basically gone undefeated. So, DK is definitely the team with the most to lose here, and Hanwha Life, if they're able to complete this cycle and move on to finals, it's going to be one of the better playoff runs that a lot of teams in the LCK have had as of late. So, very excited about this series. I think both teams have advantages and disadvantages. Of course, the big matchup that everyone's going to be looking at is Showmaker versus Zeka in the mid lane. Showmaker has been the best player in the LCK so far in 2025, at least in my opinion, and Zeka is a big game player, somebody who steps up when he really needs to. But I do think there are some ancillary pieces on both teams that need to lock in. I think Zeus versus Siwoo is going to be a very intriguing matchup. If Siwoo cannot survive against Zeus, that's going to be a bit of a problem for DK. He's done a great job at being able to contest a lot of these other top laners, these experienced top laners so far this year, but this is a bit of a different challenge. Zeus is a very good best of 5 player, and Siwoo is obviously a rookie. This is his biggest challenge ever in his entire career. This is the biggest series he's ever played, so we'll have to see how he handles that. Lucid versus Peanut is also one that I'm really intrigued by. This actually didn't go particularly well for Lucid the last time these two teams played in a best of 5, and so I'm interested to see how that goes. Aiming and Barrel versus Viper and Delight is certainly one of those matchups that I think could go in favor of Hanwha Life, but all of that comes down to whether or not DK can get their stereotypical advantages through the middle of the map and in the mid game where they have been able to dominate. So stylistically, DK just needs to keep doing what they've done. They've adapted to the new meta and the new map really well, and Hanwha Life needs to be able to play towards maybe the parts of their map that they're not quite as used to playing towards. Maybe play towards top lane a lot more than you were the past couple of years, and bot lane might need to be more of a priority in the early game. I think that is also possible for HLE. So I can definitely see avenues in terms of team composition for both of these sides to win, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to which side has the best couple of players. Like, whoever just performs the best on the given day is probably going to walk out of this series with the win. That's just the talent level that we are at when it comes to these two teams. I think DK is definitely the more cohesive team. So that's kind of the preview, but the only way to know how this series ends up going is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's go ahead and get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take this first game. They're going to go up 1-0. They were on blue side here for game number 1. Certainly something to kind of point out, because blue side has just been so influential in the first couple series for HLE in particular. It wasn't for either of the Nongshim series, mostly because they were either the better team by a lot in their series against KT, or they were the worst team by a lot in their series against Damwon or Dplus Kia, and so it's just difficult to get a read on whether or not you should take that into account too much. But in the series that have been back and forth between a couple of top tier teams, like, blue side has actually mattered a ton, and HLE gets blue side here for game number 1, which is a pretty gigantic advantage. It means they're probably probably going to have blue side control for a majority of this series, and it's going to kind of force DK to actually win a game on red side in order to win this series, which isn't always the easiest thing in the entire universe. That's just a little bit of an aside. Hanwha Life just kind of played better and drafted a little bit cleaner in this game, in my opinion. There were a couple of picks that I'm a really big fan of when it comes to Hanwha Life, and, you know, I like DK's draft. I think it does play into their strengths and the things that they have done well, but HLE just kind of played their own style, kind of looked at what DK was doing really well, went the opposite direction, and came out on top because of it. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, for me, pretty obviously is going to go to Viper. I think this needs to go to one of three players, either Viper, Delight, or Peanut. I think those were the three players that were the most impactful on this game as a whole, but Viper was the damage carry, and he was the one that they were really setting up in a lot of these 5v5s, which is where HLE wanted to put a lot of their resources, and that really ended up paying off. Of course, not the early game lead that DK was looking for. A lot of that mostly because I think Vi really has trouble snowballing the game out of control against this particular draft from Hanwha Life. You actually have a lot of lanes that I think are in really good spots. I think Xayah should be totally fine early. I think Asante should be totally fine early. It's difficult to take advantage of a Yone in that same kind of way, especially if Maokai is going to spend resources there. And so Vi can't really like snowball this game out of control. Really what DK's comp ends up turning into is this mid-game spike comp where you're hoping to try to get these 3v3 picks around skirmishes. Again, something DK is very adept at. Showmaker on something like Twisted Fate, where he can just, you know, be anywhere he needs to be, and, you know, him plus Vi and plus Rakan really in any circumstance can create a play at any moment, can get a pick really at any moment. But you do have a ton of safety on HLE. Xayah is just naturally a lot more safe as an AD carry. That's a big reason why I really like that pick for them, and Maokai actually really helps out that transition, in my opinion, for HLE, not to mention that scales really well into the late game. And as we saw, this 5v5 potential from HLE, just if they got to the 5v5 stage of the game where they were fighting over major objectives, there was just no way they were ever going to lose those because their comp is just way better designed to be able to win them. And I think that's what HLE ended up playing for. Typically speaking, I don't like playing for these like scaling 5v5 comps in this meta, but if you can get there, and especially if you have a jungle matchup that you feel confident in this case, the Maokai doing a lot of work and Peanut in general piloting it really well, I think that that's obviously a huge positive, and that does set up the Xayah to really start to take over. So all of that to say, Viper did an absolute ton of damage, especially in the back half of this game when they're fighting from front to back, and he was a pretty easy choice for player of the game. But Delight was excellent on the Nautilus. This was a truly large support gap. Delight has been the best support in the world so far in 2025. I have not been very shy about saying that on this channel. I think in terms of just raw performances, Delight's not only been the best support, he's easily been the best player on Hanwha Life. Like, it's not even been remotely close. This guy is like just absolutely dominating right now. He's playing the best league of his entire career. I said Peanut was really good. Maokai was super viable and super relevant. Zeka was totally fine. Definitely the better of these two mid laners. He needed to be able to generate as much pressure in the mid game as the Twisted Fate could around the map, and I think he did a good job at that. And then Zeus was solid on the top side, even if he wasn't like the main character or anything like that in this performance. Overall, just a good game for Hanwha Life. Definitely controlled a lot of the tempo and, you know, forced things in their favor. They needed to avoid this mid-game disaster that, you know, DK could inevitably try to create with this comp, and they did that. They got such a big lead that DK couldn't actually capitalize on their draft, and honestly, that's kind of DK's fault. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Showmaker on this Twisted Fate. This pick did not work. It was not really all that relevant. He's very good at this champion. He's played it a ton over the course of his career, but it did not really fit here. And I like the draft around it. Like, if you're going to play for Twisted Fate, like Kai'Sa win condition, like you have some outs in the later half of the game if Kai'Sa does get fed, but the problem is you don't really have a ton of like actively like 1v1 or 2v2 winning lanes in this situation. Top lane's never going to be able to like spiral, and I don't think Kai'Sa Rakan is going to do even remotely fine into Xayah Nautilus early, as long as there isn't like a ton of intervention. Like, you're hoping the Twisted Fate can get prio and move around, but Maokai does make that a lot more difficult just naturally. And so when you're looking for these mid-game skirmish advantages in these 3v3s to try to get these picks and, you know, try to just get a small gold lead that you can spiral out of control with a map advantage through global ultimates like Twisted Fates, like, if you don't have an early lead to be able to move off of that, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be down 2k gold at, you know, 11 or 12 minutes with this team comp. I just don't really see a lot of outs for that. And Showmaker, I think, played kind of poor. Like, he was doing no damage and he wasn't really offering a ton for the team. He was really an important part of what this draft was, and I don't think he played particularly well. So that's definitely something to point out. Beryl was not very good. There was a huge support gap in this game. Lucid definitely got out jungled. How much of that is the matchup, I think, is up to your interpretation, but Lucid was not particularly relevant on an first pick Vi for DK. And then Aiming and Siwoo, they weren't the problem here. Like, Siwoo was honestly fine. I'm certainly not criticizing him the most. I actually think his scoreline kind of betrays how relevant he was on the R5 Gnar. Aiming was not the problem here, but he wasn't exactly the solution. That's kind of general Aiming. But overall, overall, like DK just kind of showing that they need to be more proactive in the early game. They need to control the tempo. It's something they've done really well. They gave over control of tempo in this game to HLE, and HLE ran away with it. It was a very, very nice win for them, but it is just game number 1. If DK can bounce back and tie it up at 1 apiece, going into game number 2, everything is forgiven. You're just going into a best of 3, which you've already shown you can win. For Hanwha Life on the other side, massive win here, and you control side selection for the rest of this series, not obviously in game 2, but let's say blue side wins games 1 through 4, you get blue side in game number 5. So that's a really big positive for HLE. Looks like Viper and Delight are showing up today, which I think are the 2 most important pieces, and Peanut had a great game number 1. If they can just kind of keep this up, if they can, continue to carry early leads into the mid and late game, that's all you really need to do. That's the HLE style. So big game number 2, we'll see if DK can tie things up or if HLE can take a dominant 2-0 lead, because the winner of game number 2 was Dplus Kia. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and they needed this kind of victory, and I think specifically they needed the way that they won this game. Not only did it go a lot longer than game number 1, it was a tad bit more back and forth, but still pretty much in control of Dplus Kia, but honestly, I don't think they did it with like a ridiculous draft advantage or anything like that. I would honestly argue I maybe like HLE's draft just a tad bit more. I think you do have some advantages for DK that HLE just don't have. This team is going to, or HLE's team is going to collapse in the back half of these games. They really have no way to be able to play out the game if they don't have a lead and if they're not able to control a lot of these objectives and poke you out with the Ezreal and the Karma before a lot of these fights start. DK's kind of in a similar vein, but you have the Varus to kind of bail you out in those instances, and so that's kind of the way that I see DK winning this game is, stalling it out a little bit longer. But the thing I was really shocked about was how effortless it was for them to generate an early lead against a comp for HLE that I think should have just had that, should have just been able to do better in the early game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game to me is very obviously going to go to Lucid. I did not have to think about this at all. A phenomenal Lilia game coming in from him. And honestly, I don't want to disparage anybody else on this team because I think all 5 members of DK stepped up and played really well in this one. They won every fight. They won every skirmish. Basically every situation that they were in, they ended up winning. They didn't play too fast. They didn't take their advantage and kind of throw it away by taking bad fights. They just played sound, controlled, chaotic League of Legends that really ended up working to their style. But all of that to me is centered around what Lucid was able to do in the mid game here and the generation that he was able to do for the rest of the team's resources. This Lilia game was phenomenal. I mean, he mega gapped Peanut in this jungle matchup. This was not even remotely close. And yes, Peanut has had his struggles on Xin Zhao. That is not a new story or anything like that. He has had issues in the past at being able to play this champion at a super high level, but Lucid to be able to take advantage of that in the way that he did across this game, super impressive stuff. Again, we've talked about Lucid a ton on this channel. All this guy has done is gotten better and better and better over the course of his career, and he is really peaking right now as a top 5-ish player in the LCK, something ridiculous. So really good stuff from him. I thought Siwoo was awesome on the top side here on the Ambessa. Ridiculous amount of damage in that matchup, and honestly, I don't love Ambessa into Camille. I love the Camille pick for HLE. I think it gives them a ton of options. It gives them more of a pick potential if you want to do some flanks while Ezreal and Karma are poking out in a lot of these skirmishes. If you theoretically have an advantage, you can follow up, with Camille plus Gallia. You have a ton of ways to be able to kind of punish a lot of what DK have if the Camille is strong, but Siwoo played this matchup excellently, ended up surviving, and was super relevant in the back half of this game. And Bessa looks incredibly strong in pro play. Aiming was very good on the Varus. He is the late game out here, and honestly, I think that was the separator. That was the thing that DK kind of knew, okay, well, no matter what happens in the early and in the mid game, as long as we get to 25-30 minutes into the game, Varus should be the strongest champ in the game with a Braum protecting him with an Ambessa to be able to peel. And then, you still have Pantheon, you still have Lilia, you still have other options, right? Aiming as a player is always really good in the back half of these games. You can rely on him to be able to bail you out of certain situations. He just was excellent. He had a really great game. Beryl was good. Showmaker was still fine on the Pantheon. He was the one player that I think had probably the easiest job in the early and in the mid game to be able to stabilize, but still actually capitalized on it and was better than Zeka in this game. Overall, you just needed to see DK do basically exactly what they did. Come out and win matchups that they're not supposed to, like the Lilia into Xin Zhao early, and then carry that through and not overchase, not be too too risky or aggressive. Understand that the longer this game goes, the better it is for you, and then calm, cool, collected, be able to close this out. That's exactly what they did, and I'm really proud of them for that. And then for HLE, this is kind of a bad game. This was not a particularly good look for them. In my opinion, everybody kind of looked bad, maybe with the exception of Delight in the support position, who was, I guess, fine on the Karma. Like, he wasn't doing awesome, he wasn't taking over the game, but he was definitely the least bad on HLE, which has kind of been the truth over the course of the entire split. But Peanut was awful. He's gonna get done of the game. Another bad Xin Zhao performance from him. He just doesn't play this champion particularly well. He never really has. He does have kind of a limited champion pool in that regard, but it's not like a stylistic thing where it's not like, oh, he can't play champions like Xin Zhao. He plays other champions that play like Xin Zhao perfectly fine. He just isn't good at Xin Zhao. I don't really know what it is. It's just specific champions that he struggles on. It's always really funny, like this and Zyra, and it's just very funny to see him have these champs that he just really can't like take advantage of in the same way. But he got mega gapped by Lucid in the jungle. This was not particularly close. Zeka and Viper were not good as a carry duo. Zeka, I'm gonna blame a little bit less because he was at the very least trying, and honestly, I think, like I said earlier, his job was probably the hardest of anybody's on HLE. I think Ezreal and Karma should have full prio into the Varus and the Braum. Obviously, Braum blocks a lot of this, poke problem, but Ezreal and Karma should still have like full prio, and if you want to lane swap, you actually should be in the advantage there. And then Zeus has probably the best matchup on the team for HLE with the Camille into the Ambessa if you do want to keep that, and he just kind of really let that down. That was not a particularly good Camille game from him, but I am kind of looking mostly at Peanut here as kind of the biggest problem. You needed to be able to generate leads in the early and in the mid game. If you're not winning early, you just don't really have a lot of ways to be able to play from behind with this comp. Like, it's not a comp that really survives in situations where you don't have a gold advantage. The Galio and the Camille aren't going to salvage you in that regard because they're just not going to be tanky enough for you to be able to survive the damage that Varus and Lilia and Pantheon are able to output if they have a gold lead in the back half of this game. And so DK doing a good job to understand that, and HLE just not getting a lead in the early game, which definitely came back to bite them. They have games like this. When they lose worse than a lot of the other top teams. We've kind of really come to expect that from Hanwha Life. They don't look good in their losses, but it's only 1-1. You can turn this back around. It's not, over or anything like that. We're going into a best of 3, and Hanwha Life has already shown that they have the resilience to be able to survive some bad losses in best of 5s. They just have to do that. Again, they have side control for the rest of the series. They have blue side in games 3 and 5 if that ends up being the case. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how things go, but if DK can carry this momentum through, can win just one game on red side with the advantages that they're able to generate playing this more controlled style, I think that's going to be pretty expected, and it's going to be obviously fantastic for DK and really prove that they are the team to beat in the LCK. So game 3, as you guys know, I think it's the most important when you're tied up at 1 apiece. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Dplus Kia. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series for the first time, 2-1, and they are going to put Hanwha Life on series point by winning a game on red side. Not that that's the craziest thing in the universe or anything. I don't want to make it out like it was last year where red side victories are just so shocking and so difficult to obtain, but we've seen that especially with these top teams, it's a very difficult thing to do regularly to win on red side. So to be able to take that 2-1 series lead and gain control of the series essentially from there, that's ginormous for DK moving forward. And honestly, they did it by just enabling their primary carry to have the best game they possibly could. This is a Zeri game. Like, there is no other way to talk about this draft. There's no other way to talk about this execution rather than looking at it and saying everything in this entire game was built up so that Zeri has an easy time taking over in the back half. HLE have a ton of engaged tools. You have Sejuani, you have, Leona, hell, you have like an Aurora flank if you really want to go that route to be able to full engage on Zeri or really any of the backliners, but DK's entire strategy this game is make sure Zeri is in as good of a position to be able to carry as possible and get, Zeri to the point in the game where she's at 3 items and can take over 5v5 in these fights, and that's exactly what happened. I really like this draft for DK. I definitely think it has more direction than HLE's, and we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Aiming is obviously player of the game. I don't think I really have to go into it all that much, although I do want to give a big shout out to both Showmaker and Lucid, who I thought were excellent in this game at being able to kind of set those things up. Showmaker was doing a ton of damage on that R5 Ryze in the mid lane. Ryze has obviously been a pick that's really worked for a lot of players, most notably Doinb and Showmaker so far this year. It's been something that has been difficult to shut down when players play it well. You don't want to pick it if you're bad. That's always been the case with Ryze. It's always been a bit difficult if you're, not in a good spot or if you're worse than your opposition, because you do have to be in a good position in order for Ryze to feel as effective as he possibly can. But obviously Showmaker is very good at the champion and is very good in general at being able to generate generate leads, and so that was a very valuable pick. Lucid was really good on the Viego, ends up going deathless across this whole game because of the setups that he was doing, but this is a Zeri game at the end of the day, and aiming came through in the clutch. Like, this is a very great performance from him. I am a bit of an aiming hater. I'm definitely not going to deny that one on this channel, but I do want to say I like him significantly more in the confines of this team. I've already talked about it so much this year, but one of the reasons I've gotten, the reputation of being an aiming hater, rightfully so, is because I don't think he can be like a #1 option on a team that wants to be like an LCK contender. I just don't think he's that kind of AD carry, but when you have Showmaker and Lucid, and even like Beryl, who's taking a bit more of the like aggressive stance in terms of the early game, aiming skill set fits really well as a third option on a team like that, where Lucid and Showmaker can be super aggressive in the mid game, and Beryl can kind of propagate that with his aggressive tendencies, and Siwoo can be fine on the top side, and aiming can just not worry about the noise, doesn't have to win in lane, doesn't have to get super fed early on and win all these skirmishes 3v3, can just rely on his ability to consistently win 5v5s later on in the game, because that's what aiming is really good at, is playing out these late game team fights, and I think this is the perfect kind of team to be able to set him up for that. Again, drafting Zeri here, I think this is like the perfect draft to make aiming feel comfortable as well. And you're allowed to put your eggs in the aiming basket. You just have to understand that he's not going to do a ton with it early on in games. As long as you're allowing him to scale up and get to the later part of the game, he's gonna be really valuable in that section, and that's exactly what he was here. Just a great game from him, but I do not want to undersell the value of Showmaker and Lucid, who both were excellent in this one. Beryl was fine on the Poppy. Wasn't like a phenomenal game, but certainly was good, and he was a big part of the protection of Zeri in the back half. Siwoo was really good, had a couple of really good ultimates, but, overall, like, DK just with a solid performance and being able to understand their win condition, and once again just playing this controlled style that I think really suits them. They are a very smart team, and they end up showing that off here again. And then for Hanwha Life, it seems like game 1 was slightly more of an outlier than maybe you would have expected. Right now it does feel like they're getting a little outplayed in a lot of consistent areas. Game 2 felt more like a mechanical outplay. This just feels more like execution outplay. I don't like their draft as much as I like their game 2 draft, and I do think they have options here, right? Like, again, you have a ton of engage tools. You have Sejuani plus Leona, and so theoretically you should be just trying to force fights as much as possible. The later this game goes, the harder it's going to be for you, because Jin's not really going to be able to break through this team. They have a lot of ways to keep Zeri safe, and unless like the Jace or the Aurora are crazy fed, then you don't really have a lot of ways to be able to take down the damage backliners of DK. But at that same time, theoretically there should be some sort of early game advantage for this team. It just didn't end up being the case in that regard. Done of the game for me is going to go to Delight on the Leona. This is probably the worst game that he has played so far in 2025. Again, I've praised him a ton on this channel, rightfully so, but this was not a great performance. The engages weren't good, and generally speaking, he just was never really able to accomplish anything. I think you could say a similar thing about Zeus on the top side with this Jace. I love Jace in this meta. I think that champion is incredibly broken, and honestly, I really don't dislike the matchup for Jace in this particular game. I think he, out of anybody on Hanwha Life, has the most potential to be able to take over in this game number 3, and it just did not happen. Peanut was fine, Zeka was fine. I'm not blaming the middle of the map, even if Lucid and Showmaker were better on the other side, because at least they were trying things, and Viper was playing Jin and just got out-damaged in the back half of these games. I like Jin in certain circumstances. I'm not sure this was one of them for me, but overall, HLE just didn't have the pressure. Once again, they kind of got outplayed in the early game, and they allowed the Zeri to get out of control, and that makes the game significantly more difficult. So for HLE, you have to be able to clean it up now. Another loss, and 3 in a row would move you down into the lower bracket, would move you into the semifinals, and it would push DK into the finals. You're going to have to win a game here in game number 4, and you're going to have to do it again in game number 5. So strap in. Best case scenario for HLE, they go another 5 games for the 3rd time in a row here, and for DK, you want to get out of this as quickly as possible. Going to a game 5 against Hanwha Life is never a good idea, and so winning this game 4 is important for them. But who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie this series back up again at 2 apiece, and for the 3rd time in a row, HLE is going to a deciding game number 5. It's honestly kind of ridiculous at this point just how consistent HLE is at getting to these game number 5s, and they've been pretty darn good at winning them so far over the course of this tournament. So DK definitely not feeling good about that, and I think especially coming off of this game 4, because this should have been a game where they ended up closing it out. This goes to to 30 minutes in a situation where DK has the much easier comp to execute without a lot of the bells and whistles that are kind of needed on the other side. And yet here we are. We're sitting here, you know, showing Beryl not really being able to do anything in this game. The full engage combo of Kennen plus Nocturne not really accomplishing much, and the damage output coming in from Victor and Corki just, again, not being enough to break through HLE. Everything just not being enough in game number 4. HLE's comp is significantly more difficult to execute. They have to have a lead in order for this game to be playable under any circumstance. If they go in to 20 minutes or even really like 15 minutes into the game, like neutral with DK, it's kind of doomed because you can't win a 5v5. I really just think it's going to be incredibly difficult to do so, but they do go into that 15 minutes with the lead, and a lot of it comes down to Nidalee. It comes down to Peanut on that Nidalee, and he's going to get player of the game once again on this champion. I think he's played it 3 times in the playoffs so far. He's played it all 3 series, and I think he's gotten player of the game for all 3 performances so far in these series. This is really, really strange. He's gone from a guy who has been unable to play this champ really under any circumstance to being a guy who's actually really good, who's like unbeatable on this champion. His early game was fantastic. He really did a great job at being able to establish not only himself, but the rest of his lanes in a good spot, specifically Viper on the Ashe, to be able to be this like gigantic damage dealer over the course of the rest of the game. Delight obviously really helped with that as well, and we'll talk about Delight in a second, but Peanut is by far the most important player, not only in the game in terms of how it actually played out, but when you look at this comp, Nidalee has to win. Like, Nidalee has to be in a spot where she can generate gold for the rest of this team, because Sylas probably won't be able to do that super consistently into Victor. Like, I don't think it's a horrible matchup or anything. I just don't think Sylas is likely going to be able to dominate that 1v1, and Ashe and Renata, like, there's just not a lot of ways to punish Corki and Shen in the laning phase. I would argue that if they do stick in the 2v2, it's, you know, better for Corki and Shen. Aatrox can beat Kennen, like, I think that's generally fine, but most of that comes down to Nidalee pressure. Like, a lot of this game comes down to how Peanut ends up playing out the early game, and he does end up playing it out really well. It's really funny to see, again, a player that just historically wasn't great at the champ actually do really well on it. So, great game from Peanut to keep things alive. The bot lane was excellent here. I really want to shout out Viper and Delight. When you look at the damage numbers, it's genuinely absurd how much damage Viper did this game on the Ashe. He probably would have gotten player of the game if, you know, Peanut wasn't as good in the jungle, but he did everything he was supposed to do throughout the entirety of this game, just kind of stuck around, did a ton of poke damage, and really controlled the game. Delight was a big part of that as well. Giant support gap here in game number 4. Beryl really did not have a good game on the Shen on the other side of this. Again, I'm going to continue to talk about Shen in the way that I have recently, in the fact that I just don't think he's as good as people are drafting him to be right now in the support position. There are better supports that are getting significantly less play than Shen, and, you know, we'll continue to talk about that. Zeus was really good on the Aatrox. I think this is a pretty decent Aatrox game, and he is kind of a pseudo, like, late game out if you really want to get to that. Sylas has a lot of good ultimates to steal. Like, there are options here, but at the end of the day, like, surviving in the early game is really the #1 thing for this draft, and that's exactly what Peanut was able to do here. And for DK, again, this draft is so easy to execute because if you get to 20 minutes into the game and you're like even close to neutral, your team fight is so much better than Hanwha Life's. It is like actually crazy. Victor and Corki are obviously a ridiculous amount of damage, but you have, you know, Kennen flanks, you have Nocturne turning the lights off to make the Kennen engages even more dangerous. You have Shen being able to salvage like a Nocturne or a Kennen with his ultimate in the middle of team fights with that gigantic shield. It's like a genuinely difficult team to end up dealing with if you ever are able to get into these 5v5 stages, but they kind of blow the game by allowing the one champion that can't get out of control to get out of control, that of course being the Nidalee. I'm not blaming everybody, but I am kind of blaming Beryl in this game. I thought he played really poor on the Shen. I continue to be really low on this champion. Again, I don't really want to, you know, shit on the LCK teams because it's clear that they are seeing something in scrims that I am not seeing, and it's kind of been successful so far in the LCK playoffs, but I'm just not a big fan of the champion. I think he's overdrafted in his current state. And I do think that it's costing teams, and this was a bad game. I think Lucid needed to do more on the Nocturne. I think Siwoo was kind of irrelevant on the Kennen. I think they're not the ones that are supposed to be carrying the load in the late game, but they are the engaged threats. Later on, you've got Victor and Corki that are supposedly supposed to be able to just output the most amount of damage of anybody in the game as we go further along, and they're not doing that even with the Victor being in a good spot, the Corki being in an okay enough spot to be able to, you know, win these fights. Again, the big problem was just that DK wasn't able to stop HLE's win condition. They only had one 1, and, you know, they played towards it. Again, I talk about this a lot. People talk about good drafts and bad drafts. I think generally speaking, good drafts just give you more options, and bad drafts take away your options and force you to play something, because at the end of the day, no draft is unwinnable. Almost every draft has a win condition. HLE had one win condition in this game, and they executed it better than DK executed theirs, and that's why they're walking out on top, and that's why we're going to a game 5. And now if you're DK, you honestly do have to be a little bit scared. You've not played these long series at all in 2025, and HLE is super experienced in these, not only from this year, but from last year as well. These players are notoriously good in game 5. Zeka is a game 5 monster. Zeus is a game 5 monster historically, and DK just don't have that same reputation. This is a massive game for both of these teams, but only one team can take it. Only one team is going to be moving on to grand finals through winners finals. Who is it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be moving on to grand finals, to the LCK Cup finals here in the winter split. One series away from qualifying to represent the LCK at the First Stand International Tournament here in 2025. Dplus Kia loses their first series of the entire year. They have not lost a best of at all, a best of 3 or a best of 5 leading into this, and it goes all 5 games, and they have everything set up to be able to capitalize and move forward, and they're not able to do so. This is honestly such a frustrating loss from them, because once again, very similar to game number 4, in my opinion, there is no real reason you can look at and say that they shouldn't have won this game, although I think this one was even worse, because yes, HLE only had one win condition in game 4, and yeah, they really didn't even have a heavy win condition. They had a win condition here in game number 5, but it was even less possible because they didn't do the setup for it in the early game, and DK was in a really good spot to capitalize on their draft's advantages, and yet you still allowed Hanwha Life back into this game through the power of split pushing, through the power of playing the map better than you, and I think a lot of that is just going to come down to DK having a couple of younger players who aren't quite used to playing in these high-pressure scenarios, and Hanwha Life being a team that is built to thrive in these high-pressure scenarios, and Zeka has now won 8 best of 5 game number 5s in a row. Genuinely a ridiculous record for him. He always comes up in the clutch, and that was true here. He's going to get player of the game for game number 5. Not player of the series, but he is going to get player of the game for me. I do think the Ahri was the most relevant champion across the entire game, although if you wanted to give this to Zeus for the Olaf game, how can I possibly say no to that? He was so relevant on this R5 pick. The one thing DK could not allow to happen is this Olaf to get out of control in side lanes, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Zeus was a menace this game, but Zeka, I thought, was just a little bit more consistent across everything. Whether you want to give it to one or the other, I think is really up to personal preference, but I do want to shout out just how unbelievably consistent Zeka is in these gigantic moments, in these high-pressure situations. The dude has genuine nerves of steel. Like, he does not get phased under any circumstance. In fact, he raises his level up in these high-pressure situations, and that's just something you have to consider. Like, he is just one of the most valuable players in the entire world, purely because you know that if you're going to a game 5 against another one of the best teams in the world, he's likely going to be the best player on the Rift, and it's been so consistent for him. It's been so regular for him over the past couple of years that you just have to be excited to see it once again here. But like I said, Zeus on the Olaf was the out here, was the, you know, the ability to pull apart DK was the out, just generally for Hanwha Life, whether that was through Zeus or Peanut, or even really Zeka on the Ahri. Whoever you needed to kind of funnel in that situation was going to be the out, and that's exactly what happened. DK have a pretty strong team fight comp if you really want to put it together. Yes, the Kled doesn't necessarily play into that, and trust me, I'm going to criticize the Kled pick because I don't think it's particularly good in this game, but you have the better 5v5, like, front to back if you're DK. If you just control the game with the lead that you had at like 25 minutes into the game, if you just play this out and actively just win your fights and don't let HLE kind of pull you out of your own comfort zone, control the game. If you just do that, the game is over, but they don't do that. They allow Zeus to get out of control. They allow Peanut to get out of control, and the game is over because of it. You know, credit to them. You know, I think both of them deserve a lot of praise, and I think, you know, they both deserve a lot of credit for this one, but player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Peanut in the jungle. I know that feels a little bit weird. I was really debating between Peanut and Viper. I think it really should go to one of those two. If you wanted to give it to Zeus like the broadcast did just because he was so relevant in game number 5, then sure, like if you really wanted to do that, that's fine, but but, you know, player of the series to me represents the entire series as a whole, and that's why I'm looking at either Peanut or Viper. I think they were the two best players. I'm giving it to Peanut because that Nidalee game really saved their series, and he was really relevant on the Jax in the jungle here, and, you know, Viper, I think, should theoretically be in the conversation because he was awesome in both games 1 and 4, even if he wasn't as relevant or as important to the team comp overall here in game 5, but I am leaning a little bit more in favor of Peanut, so he is the one who ends up getting it there. But Delight was really great throughout this series. You know, Zeka and Zeus really came up in the clutch. This was just exactly what you wanted to see from HLE. They have played 15 games in their 3 series in the playoffs so far. They have played more games this year than any other team in the entire world, and it shows. This team is comfortable. They have gotten better and better and more consistent, and they do show up in the clutch, and they're going on to grand finals with the hopes that they're going to be able to continue that record, maybe in a rematch against DK. But for DK on the other side, this is such a disappointing end. Like, you should have won this game. There is no excuse for you losing this game, if I'm being entirely honest with you. The lead that you had in the early late game, like throughout the entire mid game, to throw that away, like to lose this game with the draft that you have from the position you were in, it's really unacceptable. Like, you can look at basically everybody on the team and kind of point and say, like, you were the problem. I think drafting Kled in the first place really put them in this awkward position where he doesn't necessarily play into the idea of the rest of this comp. It's specifically to try and throw off the Ahri in the early game, which didn't even really end up working, and the Kled did end up being a problem for this team. I think having the Gragas is a really big positive, but Siwoo just wasn't quite as practiced at playing out these like late game situations against an Olaf, and because of that, he's going to get out of the game for game number 5. I don't think he was the biggest problem. He is a big reason why I think they should have been good in these team fights, because he honestly just beats Misfortune, who is going to be the biggest team fight problem for HLE on the other side. If you are going to be forcing at a lot of these objectives, like, you just ult the MF. Like, it's actually really simple to be able to beat MF as Gragas. It's a big counter pick. It used to be in the support position, at least, and Siwoo just wasn't relevant enough. I think Beryl continued to struggle a little bit on the Alistar. Aiming was fine, but, you know, again, the Mel is not performing particularly well from, like, a winning perspective in the LCK. I think it's 0-4 so far to start, so certainly something to keep in mind. It does well in terms of damage and in terms of KDA, but doesn't really win games right now. And then Lucid was also just not, like, good enough. Like, he is a big part of the aggressive nature here, and a lot of this just comes down to the overall philosophy. If DK is going into 25 minutes with a lead with this comp, you can't lose the game. Like, there is just no way that you can, like, feasibly allow yourself to lose this, especially you didn't give over any Void Grubs, you know, you didn't give over anything. You lost a lot of the important fights that you needed to. You lost at Otacon, you lost at Baron. Like, these are things that are not acceptable. And quite frankly, those are the things that held them back. But now they're going to be going down into the lower bracket. They're going to be taking on the winner of the series we're going to talk about later between Gen.G and Nongshim. They're going to be favorites against either of those teams. I feel pretty confident in saying that, and I think there's a real shot that we get this rematch in the finals. And you know what? I'm certainly not counting out Dplus Kia in that series, because they probably should have won this series. They just didn't end up being able to do so. DK obviously has a lot they need to work on, but this was really the first time that they were truly tested so far this year, and unfortunately for them, they hit a roadblock. Hopefully they can overcome it, but for Hanwha Life, they have been tested over and over and over again, and they have continuously come out on top. I was going into the playoffs with this idea that this team was really struggling and that they were kind of on the border of being, you know, an upper tier team for me, and now they're the team to qualify for grand finals out of the winner's side of this bracket, going undefeated in these best of 5 so far. They've looked incredible, about as good as you could possibly ask for from a team like this, and the clutch gene has very much not gone away. But then moving on now to our second of the best of 5s here today, and this one is going to be moving down to the lower bracket. We know the loser, obviously, from the winners finals. The winner of this series will take them on in the lower bracket finals to see who takes on Hanwha Life in the grand finals. It's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Gen.G and the number 6 seeded Nongshim RedForce. Obviously, kind of a mismatch on paper, quite a large mismatch on paper if we're being entirely honest. Gen.G looks like a team that really shouldn't struggle at all against Nongshim, but there are some things I think to talk about in this series and in this matchup that could theoretically make it closer, most notably that Gen.G just has not clicked in the way that we thought they would at the start of this year. They've had some inconsistencies. They were another team that I was concerned about going into the playoffs, especially because they had like 2 weeks off before they played a single best of 5 after the group stage because they were on the winning side. I think that was more of a detriment than anything else for this team, and I think we kind of saw that against Hanwha Life when they couldn't quite overcome that over the course of that series. You were looking at players players like Ruler and Canyon not really stepping up, not being the players that we thought they were going to be for this team at the time. Duro has obviously not been like a top tier support at the start of this split, but that was more expected. It's more so Canyon and Ruler struggling, in my opinion, that's been a little bit of a surprise. Now, there are some positives for Gen.G. Chovy has been Chovy to start this year. Quite frankly, there's really no other way to say that. He has been exceptional. He has still been, one of the best players in the world in terms of his individual performances. He's just not had the team around him in order to back him up in that same kind of way. If you just get even like a modicum of a good performance out of Canyon and Ruler and Keen and Duro, like this team is good enough to steamroll this series and they're gigantic favorites for a reason. This is kind of a get right series, if you will, but there are some concerns. And for Nongshim, as much as I'd like to try to hype this team up, I just don't think they're particularly good. They got over KT Rolster because they are incredibly one-dimensional, and I would argue Nongshim is just more well-rounded than KT Rolster is, even if they don't have the top-tier talent that, BDD is. They don't have a player like that on the team, although Lehens is pretty darn close, and maybe Lehens is better than BDD. I think it really is up to your own interpretation. Both of them are excellent, but they are definitely better elsewhere across the board. Their bot lane was definitely better, their top lane was definitely better in that series, and that got them over KT in the first round. But once they went up against an actually good team in Dplus Kia, they just got slaughtered. They won a game basically out of pity in game number 3 when DK wasn't even trying, and even outside of that, like, they didn't look particularly good in their losses. They got steamrolled in all 3 of the games they ended up losing. Fisher was mega outclassed. Even someone like Gideon, who I think has been good, just felt like he wasn't on the same level as someone like Lucid. I think there is like a ceiling to what Nongshim can offer with the roster that they currently have, but there are some things to look out for that could be positive. Lehens could theoretically be the second best player in this series. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say, like only behind Chovy, and if that's the case, these games become a lot more interesting if he has a lot of agency, and if he is playing super aggressive in the early game, generating like small gold leads for Nongshim, all of a sudden you can start translating that into 3v3 skirmish victories, and you can go from there. That's how Nongshim has been successful so far this year, but outside of that, I just don't really see a lot of avenues for this team to succeed. Like, you're going to have to hope that Gen.G is off their game, that someone like Duro is bad enough that Lehens just completely support gaps him the entire series, and that's such a big difference that the rest of the team can't actually capitalize, that Ruler and Canyon continue their downward trajectory, that Keen can't really take over on the top side. You have to hope for all those things if you're Nongshim, because if Gen.G actually is playing the way that they're supposed to, that their names would indicate, the series is just not going to be particularly close. And so my projection was a Gen.G 3-0 win. I think that anything else would be looked at as a bit of a disappointment from them, and Nongshim, I think, is just looking to be competitive. If they can win a game or two in this series, they're going to feel pretty good about it, but I don't think they really have like a thought of moving on, or at least that would be my prediction heading into the series. We'll see if it ends up leading into that, but the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0, not in the like assertive, dominant type of way that maybe you would have wanted to see out of them in game number 1, but certainly not like the worst performance in the entire world. I think people are going to overrate how they played in this game. Their early game was just not good enough, and I still think that their draft was not necessarily played to in terms of their win conditions, but, some weird picks, flopping the set and the Galio top mid, kind of flexing them, I guess is the term, between the 2 solo lanes ends up kind of working out here for Gen.G, and Nongshim just doesn't have enough firepower to be able to come away with the victory in the end. It's frustrating because I think Nongshim drafted a comp that should theoretically get better as the game goes along, specifically in comparison to Gen.G, who once again is relying on a lot of early pressure coming out of the middle of the map with Canyon, with Chovy, even Keen, like just winning really hard in their individual lane matchups and then translating that to a gold lead. That didn't happen. Nongshim had a gold lead, like a very small one, but a gold lead, was basically neutral at 20 minutes into this game, and you're looking at that as a huge positive for Nongshim. They just can't quite hold on. They give over the game. They can't win fights, and all of a sudden it's over. The map is played better by Gen.G, who have a more difficult to execute comp. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Ruler in the bot lane. We talked about him needing to step up, about him and Canyon needing to be the 2 players that, really kind of showed that they were on point right now. We'll just say for Gen.G that they were good enough to get back to their regular form. That kind of happened in game number 1. Canyon's scoreline definitely is better than the game that he ended up playing, but I think Ruler was super essential towards this victory on the Ezreal. He is probably the easiest way for you to be able to win fights later on in the game, and he was doing a ton of damage. There is a lot of setup here if you do need to get to the later half of the game with the set, with the Galio, with the Leona. You have a ton of ways to be able to make it easier on Ezreal to take over, and that's exactly what Ruler did. Again, all he needs to do is just be Ruler. He doesn't have to be like a dominant 2v2 force. He just needs to be the guy that can win skirmishes in the mid game and is super consistent in the back half, mechanically speaking. He can make mistakes. He just needs to lock in when it comes to playing aggressive and actually stepping up when his team needs him. The big problem that he had in the previous series against Hanwha Life is that he was way too passive, that he played way too scared, and that was not really the case in this one. I think Ezreal is a pretty good champion for him in that regard. I do want to shout out Duro. I thought he was fine here in game number 1. A couple of weird pathing decisions. This guy has some weird mental decisions that he just needs to like lock in for, but the mechanical skill is definitely there. Chovy was fine on the set. The R5 set's a really interesting pick here. I kind of would have liked it in the top lane a little bit more. Like, I get that you like the matchups here, and theoretically, like, this gives you a better matchup around the board. Like, the set is definitely better into the Yone than the Galio is, and I think that that is probably why you end up making this decision, but I love set into Rumble. I think that that's a very good top lane matchup. Just a personal opinion thing there that I think I would have preferred to see this on Keen, but it ends up really working out. Chovy is obviously practicing set because he knew a lot of the intricacies this game, and, you know, Chovy versus Fisher is one of those matchups that I just expect to be a nightmare for Nongshim, and that's how it was here in game 1. Again, Canyon scoreline probably a bit better than, you know, his actual gameplay would indicate. He wasn't nearly as aggressive in the early game as you would want, but he did gap Gideon. Like, Gideon was not good, especially later this game ended up going, and Keen was fine. Overall, like, people are going to overrate this loss for Nongshim. They're going to talk about the good things that they did in the middle of the game, but I don't think Gen.G ever felt like they were entirely out of it. They pretty much had full control over this one. And then for Nongshim, you just wanted to see some more consistent and clean team fighting in the back half of the game. This was something they opted into in their series against DK, where they were willing to give over a ton of pressure in the mid game in order to secure a comp that could be a little bit consistent in the late game if they did end up getting there. They never really got there against DK. They never really were allowed to get there because DK was just so controlled in the mid game, but now they are able to get to the late game, and they still can't win the team fights with a comp that I think is a little bit more kind of into that section. It's just a little bit frustrating. Like, when you're layering Yone Ultimate and Rumble Ultimate and, you know, Braum Ultimate, I guess, to that extent as well, even the Vi and Ashe engages with their ults, like, you would hope that you would be able to win this because Nidalee's basically a non-factor, and if Ezreal's going to be the entire damage on the other side of this matchup, like, you have way more than that. It just didn't end up being the case. You had a gold lead, a small one here, but you didn't play the map well enough, and you ended up giving over too much. Gideon is going to get dead of the game for that. I don't think his Vi was particularly good at all. This champ, I think, is continuously overvalued by a lot of pro teams, and, you know, I think that was very well reflected here. Even if I don't think Canyon was perfect, Gideon was bad, and he needs to be better moving forward. Fisher looks like he's going to be outclassed in the mid lane. I've never liked his Yone. I think he's played this champion really poorly in a lot of different games. This wasn't the worst game of all time, but I think it could have been better. I don't like Lehens on Braum. I think you need something more aggressive for him. You need something that can be a bit more of a playmaker in order for this team to really feel like they have control. Like, Kingen and Jiwoo were generally fine, but Nongshim just didn't necessarily draft the way I think they need to in order to win games against a team that is better than them or to play to their individual strengths, and I think it really cost them here. But it is just game number 1. You don't want to freak out too much. You don't want to panic. You just want to sit back and go, you know, we can take this as a learning experience. I would have hoped they would have learned from the DK series that drafts like this don't work, but alas, here we are. So hopefully they can learn from this one. And for Gen.G, I would love to see them put their foot on the gas a bit more in the early game. That's kind of what you want to see from Gen.G, is them actually controlling their own destiny instead of just outskilling their opponent because they are just infinitely better. That doesn't necessarily encourage me that they can translate that to something bigger than beating Nongshim, but they're up 1-0. If they can go up 2-0, that's massive. If Nongshim goes down 0-2 to Gen.G, you can basically call that a series. Like, it's going to be very difficult to come back and win 3 games in a row from that. So a big game number 2 here. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And what the hell was this game? Truly, what was this performance? Not only from Gen.G, but from Nongshim, from both of them. How is it even physically possible for Nongshim to lose this one? They were like 4 autos away from taking the Nexus on an Elder Dragon push, and yet here we are. Gen.G ends up being able to not only survive this unbelievably bad mid game that they end up having, but end up winning an Elder Dragon fight, pushing down the mid lane and ending the game at 44 minutes. It felt impossible, but yet here we are. A ridiculous 44-minute banger that Nongshim threw away. There are a lot of players on Nongshim that I do want to credit, a lot of players on Nongshim that I want to be a bit upset by, that I think played a little bit too poor at the end of this game and really kind of cost their team in terms of their positioning. But I guess we got to talk about Gen.G first and foremost. A lot of pluses, a lot of minuses to talk about in this game. If you've noticed, the dud of the game is actually going to stay on the winning side, but we'll get to that. Player of the game, to me, it's kind of got to go to Chovy. He was the most important player in these final fights in terms of the damage he was outputting. I get that his gold numbers weren't great. I get that Fisher ended up being able to pick him off in side lanes every once in a while, but when it really mattered, this Aurora was the champion that was really putting in the work down the stretch, and it continues to be Chovy that comes up in the clutch for Gen.G. Now, I don't want to, make it out like it was just him or anything like that. I think Ruler, being up in gold for a majority of this game over Jiwoo, who played pretty poor on the other side of this matchup for Nongshim, even with so much help, was huge for Gen.G to be able to survive a lot of these instances, and Ruler being able to survive in the base for that push where they had Elder Dragon was gigantic. I think Canyon played a ton better than he is going to get credit for on the Xin Zhao. Keen, I think, had moments on the Camellia. Even Duro had moments here on the Poppy where he was able to enable the rest of the team, but this really was like Chovy, Ruler, and Canyon, in my opinion, just 3v7ing at the end of this game, being so strong that they end up winning fights and kind of pushing it forward. I'm happy for Gen.G. I'm happy they were able to pick up this victory, but what happened with the rest of this game? I get it. Like, your draft is not going to spike in the mid game, and that's exactly what Nongshim ended up drafting for. You have a comp here that's really good at skirmishing 3v3, that really wants to play around a lot of these new objectives, and they do a really great job at doing that for a majority of the game. They're able to secure Otacon. They're able to do really well at gathering dragons to get to Elder and get that Ocean Soul, and, they really put themselves in a fantastic position, and a lot of that, I think, is the draft. You really do spike hard in the mid game with Nongshim's draft, but for Gen.G to just allow them to control the game in the same way that they, failed to do in game number 1, it's frustrating. Like, Gen.G needs to play like they're the better team, and they're not necessarily doing that right now. They need to draft like they're the better team, and I don't think this draft necessarily does that. I'm really not a big fan of this draft for Gen.G, and I think that is a big part of why they put themselves in this hole, but that kind of ties into my dud of the game. Duro in the support position. Dude's gotta stop getting caught out. Like, he is actually starting to become a major issue for Gen.G, that he is getting caught out over and over and over again. I think his highlight plays, his good moments are still incredibly good, and he didn't have this problem on FearX last year. He just didn't. He wasn't this kind of player on FearX, but I think with the added pressure of not only playing for Gen.G, but this team kind of struggling in a couple of different avenues, I think it is adding onto his back and adding onto the weight of this and causing him to play maybe a bit worse than he normally would, because this Poppy game just wasn't good enough. He tried to lose Gen.G this game and ended up failing, and I think a lot of that goes to Chovy, some of that goes to Ruler, some of that goes to Canyon. I think, some of that, a little bit of it goes to Keen, but like Duro tried his best to lose this game, and as high on him as I was going into the year, I just can't feel good about this kind of performance. And outside of that, Gen.G just needs to clean up their mid games. Again, I would love to see them finally draft something that has actual agency and control over the direction the game heads in. I would love to see a team that either has a ton of prio in the mid game or has some way to be able to push the tempo early that doesn't completely fall off in the late game. Right now, it just feels like they're drafting for one specific win condition, and even in this game, your win condition is Nongshim being worse than you, and that's exactly what they were. And so I'm just not a big fan of where Gen.G is at right now, but they're up 2-0 regardless, and for Nongshim, this is the game that got away. This has got to feel incredibly frustrating, because now you're down 0-2 to Gen.G, and it was entirely self-inflicted. You absolutely should have won this game. You won it in draft, you won it in the mid game, you did everything you were supposed to do, and then you couldn't finish it off, and the one fight that really mattered around that second Elder doesn't go your way, and all of a sudden the game is over. It's definitely not ideal. It's definitely not the best case scenario for them, but at least they're showing some fight. Really, all we wanted to see out of Nongshim in a series like this was that they were kind of in it, that they could be interesting against a team like Gen.G, and trust me, they were way more than interesting in this game. I think if I were to give major props to a couple of individual players, I think that Kingen was awesome in this game on the Mbessa. I think he's going to go really undervalued. I think playing Mbessa into something like Poppy in a lot of these situations is honestly kind of difficult, and I think Kingen did a really good job. Fisher, I thought, was really good on Mel. Mel loses another game. I don't think Mel has won a single game in the LCK. It's actually been ridiculous. I think she's 0-5 or something like that in the LCK so far. It's not been a good look, but this champ always does a ton of damage. It just it hasn't been winning, and it's very unfortunate. I think Gideon played fine on the Sedge, really did a great job of setting things up in the mid game. Lahen was aggressive, but didn't have to be the best player on the Rift, which was really good. Jiwoo really held this team back. I'm going to be honest. This Misfortune is really starting to look like a bad pick in a lot of situations. I've not been impressed with it so far on the new map. I don't think it really plays into a lot of the strengths of the new map, and Jiwoo in particular, his positioning this game was really just horrendous. I think he was a big reason why Nongshim ended up giving over so much pressure, was him just getting caught out way too early on in fights, the ults not being good enough, etc., right? Nongshim had a lot of problems. You had Kingen and Fisher stepping up way too far at the end of this game, especially Fisher, who just got way too far ahead of himself, if we're being honest. But, you know, Jiwoo, I think, was definitely the player I was looking at and saying, like, you have to be better than whatever this performance was for this team to win. But now they're down 0-2. It's a horrible place for them to be. They have to win 3 in a row to take this series off of Gen.G. I think at this point they're looking for a game win. If they can win game 3 and just survive until game number 4, they're going to feel pretty good about that, because they probably should have won game number 2 here. And if they are able to, you know, go out and show a clean performance from start to finish, like, that's at least something to take away. But for Gen.G, you got to start cleaning this up. I would love to see this team actually just go out and dominate game 3 and, you know, kind of cement themselves. This is supposed to be a touch-up series for Gen.G. This is not supposed to be a struggle, and this game definitely was a struggle. So, you know, game 3, not particularly important in terms of the overall outlook of this series unless things go crazy awry, but definitely one where I think both teams need to show me something in order for me to feel better about them. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was NS RedForce. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series and still be down 1-2, but be alive at the very least. And you know what? They played out this game pretty well. They were the better team across this whole one. They actually were able to close out a lead that they were able to get. Once again, I do think they have a little bit of a draft advantage in this one. I think there are some concerns with being able to match the Jacks if the game goes super late, but for the most part, your team fight is ridiculously good, significantly better than Gen.G's. You have way more damage, even if you don't have a ridiculous amount of frontline. Lily asleep plus Renata ultimate should be enough to be able to deter that, and obviously a lot of these champions themselves have safety. Corki has self-peel, Anivia can theoretically self-peel and has egg. Like, there's a lot of, you know, safety on the side of NS in terms of what they drafted, and obviously their damage is off the charts as well, and Gen.G just didn't really have an answer when you're looking at, you know, a team that has a losing mid lane, in my opinion. I think Corki should have prio over Sylas, even if Chovy was a lot better than Fisher in this game, and a losing top lane for sure. Like, Jax can't compete with Anivia early on. You have a team that gets outscaled if the game goes long. I'm just not really sure what the win condition is, because Jax needs to get fed in order to play a side lane, which I guess is probably what I would have tried to do here, but it's just difficult to get that done, and I think that there are a lot of ways you can point to that Gen.G didn't necessarily do well trying to execute on that goal. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Lehens in the support position. This was not a difficult decision. When he's on a playmaker, when he's on a champion that can be kind of a team fight show stealer, if you will, then he is going to do that. He is an absolute menace. He's still one of the best supports in the world. I think he's been right up there with Delight for the best support so far in 2025. I don't think anybody from the LPL has really been able to compete on that level, but what Lehens has been able to do on a team that is significantly worse than his talent level is genuinely ridiculous. His Renata was awesome here in game number 3, and he's going to be the reason this team continues to win if they do continue to win. Just another great performance from him. I want to give a big shout out to Gideon. Criticized him quite a bit for that game number 1. It felt like he really misplayed on the Vi, not being aggressive enough in the early game and not pushing his advantages enough in the mid game. And on the Lilia, it was kind of the opposite. This was a really, really solid game. He was better than Canyon, basically across the whole game. Did a great job of generating gold and just being able to maintain that gold lead, you know, properly showing up to objective timers at the right time and, you know, pressuring out the enemy jungler. This is what you want to see from a jungler who has a gold advantage like he did in this game. The Anivia is going to catch a lot of people's attention. At this point, this isn't even a crazy pick anymore. I think it's really nice as an answer to Jax because, like I said, like, it's going to be a problem for Jax to be able to answer that early, and Jax needs to have gold in order for this Gen.G comp to be as effective as I think it wants to be. The Corki should be fine on its own. The Jinx is going to scale. The Anivia is obviously going to scale as well, and you have Lehens for team fights. Like, it's just a really well-rounded draft. I think maybe you want a bit more frontline, like, theoretically. That's really the only, like, immediate concern that I can see, but outside of that, I just like the way Nongshim ended up drafting and playing out this game. I think they looked good across the board, maybe with the exception of Fisher, who could have been a bit better in that mid lane matchup, but, you know, it's Fisher versus Chovy. If that's going to be your only weak point and everybody else is going to win, that's absolutely ginormous for Nongshim moving forward. So, nice win. They stay alive. We'll see if it actually matters or means anything moving forward, but for Gen.G, they just don't have it right now, man. Like, they're not clicking in the way that they are supposed to at the current moment, and it is kind of concerning for me. I think that there are two players that you can definitely point out as duds of the game. Canyon and Duro, I think both ended up playing really poorly. Duro with another bad game across this series. The only reason he's not getting dud of the game for me here in particular, he's not getting the one on the graphic, is because I think he he made a really nice play in the mid game on the Rakan. I think this is clearly his best champion, and you can see that mechanical ceiling with him in this game. I don't think everything was his fault or anything like that, but he just wasn't nearly as useful as he should have been in this matchup. I'm giving dead of the game to Canyon, who I think needed to do a lot more in the jungle. I've honestly been super disappointed in Canyon so far in 2025. Not only is this worse than what he was last year on Gen.G, to me right now this is worse than 2023 DK, this is worse than 2022 Damwon. Like, I think this is the worst Canyon has ever played in terms of like a short stretch, like an important short stretch. He's just not in good form at the current moment. He'll have good games every once in a while, but it is certainly not consistent, and he needs to be aggressive early here on the Wukong. If he isn't, like we said, Nongshim just has a better 5v5, and you need to be able to get Jax ahead in order to keep up in the later half of the game. It just didn't really happen. Keen was completely irrelevant, couldn't play out this Jax into a Nivea matchup, not entirely his fault. Ruler didn't really get to do anything on this R5 Ziggs. Don't love that for Ruler individually as a player because he has actually been playing fine, I would say, in this series. Chovy continues to be the best player on Gen.G, had a really good game on the Sylas that just did not matter. It's frustrating, right? Gen.G has really proven themselves to be who they are. They are a team where Chovy is going to look really good and everybody else just needs to hope and pray that he can carry them across the finish line. How did we get here? It feels ridiculous. That being said, it's still their only loss of the series up until this point. If they had lost game 2 and they were on elimination point here, I would genuinely be freaking out. I would talk about how this team is in kind of panic mode right now, but at the end of the day, you know, they're still up 2-1. They're still in a position where if they win this game 4, they can close this out. They just need to not lose game 4. If you barely scrape out, you know, a win in game 2, even really kind of come back in game number 1 and then lose game 3 and 4, like that's a disaster. Like game 5 is not in your favor in that case. And Nongshim honestly has looked really good in this series. They've looked a lot better than I anticipated them to. I think their drafting has been really good, and I think they have learned from their mistakes in that regard from the DK series. If they can carry that forward and win this game 4, it truly is anybody's game in game number 5. So let's go ahead and check it out. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Nongshim RedForce. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we are looking at a Silver Scrapes game number 5 and a potential reverse sweep coming in from Nongshim, and boy, it's not looking good for Gen.G. Things are collapsing at a historic rate for this organization that have been basically the kings of domestic LCK play for years and years and years, like half a decade up until this point, like 2019, 2020 onward. It really hasn't felt like they've been hyper contested by anyone other than Damwon for like a small period of time, especially like 2022 onwards. It just has not felt like they have really been like contested in a way, and now it feels like they're falling apart with a roster that should be good enough for them to still be top of the league. It's actually ridiculous, and boy, I feel awful for Chovy because he is playing out of his mind. He played so well in this game on the Victor. It just did not matter. Another gigantic draft gap for Nongshim. Another really big win for them with a much clearer job and a much clearer execution. Not only do they have a team that's going to be really good at playing these long drawn out games that seem to be commonplace between these two teams right now across this series, but you have so many easy ways to engage. You have so many different ways to start fights and to make things happen in these 5v5s. Obviously, Zac is a big part of that, but the Alistar, Orianna, and Varus ultimates are both excellent for that. You have tons of ways to be able to facilitate fights, and honestly, I don't know what this Gen.G draft does. It feels like it's lost all sense of cohesion. I don't know what Nocturne does on this team even a little bit, because you kind of just want to poke out Nongshim. Like, you have Varus, you've got Jhin, you've got Jace, but like Nocturne and Rel both like want to hard commit and hard engage, and Nocturne's not really going to be useful outside of that situation. The Zac essentially just makes the Nocturne useless in general, and, you know, it's not like the Rel's going to be all that useful, especially with how Duro played in this game. I just don't really understand these drafts from the side of Gen.G. It feels like they lack a lot of cohesion, and it feels like they lack a lot of direction, and I think that's something Nongshim is taking advantage of. Player of the game here in Game 4, to me, is going to go to Gideon. It has to go to one of the two members in the middle of the map, either Gideon or Fisher, whoever you think was more relevant. Fisher was definitely more relevant in terms of the damage he was able to output. Not that Jiwoo wasn't in that zone, but Fisher was more relevant throughout the whole game. But I just want to give a big shout out to how well Gideon played on the Zac in this game number 4. I think Zac's a very, very strong champion to just go in and just not think about it too much. Just kind of play the style, right? Play this engage-oriented comp. Just play around a Zac jumping in, and, you know, it just makes the process so much easier for Nongshim. And Gideon, I think, has been really good at these simple to execute, you know, kind of late game style champions. Not that Zac can't do things in the mid game, but just, create these 5v5 situations. Force Gen.G to have to answer you in these Baron situations, fighting around Chemsol, things like that. Like, force, Gen.G to have to make a decision in that regard, because they don't have the tools to be able to make those decisions easier. You can't really poke out Cassante, Zac, Alistar in the way that you would need to with Victor plus Jace. It's not going to work out in that same way, and I think Zac was a big part of that. Of course, like I said, the Orianna for Fisher, also great. He's actually been fine in this series. I think Chovy has been arguably better on the other side of this, but that's just an unreal expectation to set yourself to. Like, the world is collapsing around Chovy, and he is doing his best to keep it up on his back, and Fisher is doing a really good job to at least try and put some pressure on him in that regard. He was awesome in this game. I want to give a big shout out to both Jiwoo and Lehens, who I thought were solid. Kingen goes deathless on Cassante. Even if he's not the most relevant champion in this entire game, it's still a pretty impressive feat. Overall, I'm just excited about Nongshim. They're going into this game 5 with all the momentum in the world. This probably should have been a 3-1 in favor of Nongshim. They should have won that game number 2. They completely threw it away with a draft that felt like it was impossible to throw that kind of lead away, and here they are going into game 5 tied up. They've got a real shot to knock off Gen.G and pull off a huge upset here, and for Gen.G, that would be an absolutely nightmarish situation. Like, I cannot talk about how disastrous that would be for this team and for this org moving in to the rest of the year. It already looks like they're not going to be able to accomplish their goal of going to first stand. Obviously, you don't really know what happens, but if they go out in 4th place, like, oh my god, it is like genuinely worst case scenario, full panic mode. Like, sound every alarm in the entire building type of bad, and so they need to try to avoid that at all costs. And honestly, this game did not give me a lot of confidence in that direction. I've already talked about it mostly. Chovy was awesome in this game on the Victor, did by far the most damage in the game. It wasn't even remotely close. This guy is trying his absolute best to carry a group of players who just do not want to win. Keen has been a complete non-factor on the top side of the map, not only this series, but the entire split. He's not been bad. He's certainly not had the negative moments that Canyon and Ruler and Duro have had, but he's not exactly been Keen. He's not had the positive moments that he had all throughout last year. Canyon, once again, had a horrible game. How much of that is him playing Nocturne in a game where Nocturne just doesn't exist? I don't really know, but it's kind of up to you to determine. Ruler was useless on Jhin. Like, Jhin is sometimes pretty good. This is not a good Jhin game. Duro was awful, though. He's gonna get dead of the game. This guy looks completely outmatched, and he's playing against Nongshim. Now, I get it, right? Like, he's going into Lehens, who's one of the best supports in the world, but it has become abundantly clear that he is not ready to hold up the weight of expectation that Gen.G needs him to hold up throughout these games. And if that's going to be the case, that's immediately going to hold back Gen.G from being one of the best teams in the LCK. Full stop. Like, no other way to possibly say it. Like, Duro has just not been good enough. Not only this series, but this entire split. I would argue that these have all been his worst games. Like, you are seeing the worst version of Duro right now, and this is a really bad time for that to happen, and I'm not trying to, put it all on him. Again, Canyon has been awful across this series and really across this split, but Duro is the biggest problem, and he gets out of the game for it. But overall, you've got to figure it out for Gen.G. You have to draft something that's even a little bit more cohesive. Like, theoretically, you should have more power than Nongshim in the early game, but then you're looking at a bunch of lane matchups that I don't think are easy to execute on. Like, if you get to level 6, if you're Nongshim and you haven't lost the game, how do you lose any of these skirmishes? I just don't really see a world where Gen.G gets themselves back into this, and so you just need to draft something more cohesive, and quite frankly, you have to win game number 5. If you lose this game 5, if you lose this series 4-1 ostensibly, that is, like, worst case scenario. Gen.G is needing a reset, and they might even look for a new support in the middle of this, like, offseason, because it really was that bad. This is not an acceptable result if it ends up happening. And for Nongshim, you're on the verge of the biggest LCK upset we've seen in many, many years. We never see upsets in the LCK. If this team ends up getting top 3, genuinely absurd. So can they pull it off? Can they keep the momentum they have had basically the entire series going into game 5? Or is Gen.G gonna right the ship and get out of here wounded but not destroyed? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to avoid certain disaster, and they will be moving on to the semifinals, to the lower bracket finals by beating Nongshim here. It genuinely took a bit of tomfoolery in order for them to get here. Nongshim once again throwing a lead that they had in the early game, this time significantly more expected though. It just felt like they didn't have the gas to be able to hang on, not only in terms of the players that they had, but in terms of the comp that they had. Gen.G's comp is very inevitable inevitable in terms of getting to the late game. I have real concerns about them being able to survive early on, and generally speaking, I wouldn't love this draft, but Nongshim, I think, went for a similar concept. Both of these teams wanted to front to back 5v5, around their hyper carry. In, Gen.G's case, it's Zeri. In Nongshim's case, it's Smolder, and just kind of hope and pray that they were strong enough to be able to win it. With Nongshim having a better early game, they were hoping that they were going to go into the late game with better tools and more resources to be able to front to back, and I think Gen.G was hoping that they'd be able to get to the late game with a better general front to back 5v5 comp, and that is exactly what happened. Player of the game to me, though, in Game 5, you're damn right. It's going to Duro in the support position on the Yuumi, because, come on, like, he put his pride aside, drafted Yuumi, and it won them the game. Like, really, that is exactly what this was. I still think Yuumi is ridiculously strong and ridiculously viable, at least in comparison to a lot of the other supports that we're seeing right now in pro play, because I think enabling a lot of these hyper carries is a super valid way to play the game, and I think a lot of people don't even want to consider it because it's Yuumi, and because that champion is annoying, and because they don't want to play against her. They don't want it to be meta. They want to pretend like it's not meta, but it is super valuable and super viable right now, and Duro, I think, put his pride aside, said, screw it, we're going to pull it out here in Game 5, and you know what? Without the Yuumi, this game becomes way harder. It genuinely does become way harder. So credit to Duro, the Yuumi was the most important champion in the game, even if he himself didn't really have to do all that much to get there. Ruler was the carry in terms of damage for Gen.G, not that that was entirely unexpected on the Zeri. This is a protect comp after all. I'm trying to play around a Yuumi-inspired Zeri. My only concern with picking the Zeri where they did is they picked Zeri knowing it was going to be Lucian Nami on the other side of this matchup, or at least assuming it was going to be Lucian Nami with the Lucian already selected. And I just don't love, like, that's a lot of confidence, man. I don't love that idea, like, from a baseline level. I don't love the idea of trying to just get to the late game and just completely disregard the early game. Pick a matchup that is super bad, try to lane swap, and just, like, hope you don't get as many advantages as the other side. Like, I'm just not a big fan of that idea in the current game. Like, I don't think I would have picked Zeri, especially in this matchup, but overall, it really ended up working out because they did get to that late game. They weren't able to get punished early enough early. And then player of the series, can it possibly go to anyone other than Chovy? It basically did not matter what happened in game number 5. Chovy could have completely run it down, been the worst player on the entire Rift. As long as Gen.G won this game number 5, Chovy was getting player of the series. He is the only player on that team who was even trying to win this series across the entirety of all 5 games. It really is not even up for debate, in my opinion. He didn't have, like, a barn burner in game number 5. He was okay on the Azir, but he wasn't dominant. Fisher definitely got more resources on the other side of this matchup because he was the one they were trying to enable on the other side. But, Chovy was so good throughout every other game of this series, and especially in their losses, he was the only one even attempting to do anything that, yeah, he's player of the series here against Nongshim, and I didn't have to think about this. Canyon was fine on the Pantheon. Keen was, a big part of why they get front to back so effortlessly on the Ornn. Overall, like, Gen.G drafted a clear and concise idea, and honestly, theirs makes a little bit more sense to me than Nongshim's. Not that Nongshim's doesn't make sense. I just think if you're going to draft, like, a protect comp, a 5v5, where you draft this hyper carry in the back half of the game, you might as well commit to that instead of also drafting Lucian Nami in the bot lane and kind of hoping that you can go in and win bot lane as well as enable Smolder. It just feels like you're trying to have the best of both worlds, and it doesn't really end up working out for them here because they aren't able to win team fights in the back half of this game. The Smolder isn't strong enough, and the Lucian Nami do end up being less relevant in the back half of this game as opposed to the Zeri Yuumi, as well as opposed to the Azir in the mid lane. So it just ends up being unfortunate for Nongshim. Jiwoo is going to get dud of the game for that. I honestly don't think Jiwoo played well in this series. I think he had quite a few bad games that kind of went under the radar because Nongshim was very exciting to watch. I think he was probably the worst player on Nongshim in this series and definitely let the team down in a couple of areas, but for the most part, it was him getting a small lead in the early game on the Lucian because of the way that the current meta exists, and then just not having the firepower, pun intended, to be able to keep going, like to be able to actually punish in the late game because the Zeri ended up getting out of control, and he couldn't break through the Yuumi, really, under any circumstance. So it just is kind of the flaw of drafting Lucian in this case, and drafting Lucian Nami in general. I get that the bot lane's good, and, I think in a perfect world, you would have gotten them even more ahead in the early game. It just didn't really end up happening that way. Fisher was actually fine in this series. I have no real major complaints about either Fisher or Gideon. I think Kingan was also fine. Like, generally, it's hard to walk away feeling bad about this series for Nongshim, but this is the end of their LCK Cup, the end of their winter split. They get 4th place. That's still a really good position for them to be in. They They took a game off of DK. They took 2 games, and honestly, they probably should have taken this series off of Gen.G. I feel pretty darn good about Nongshim as like a top 5 team in the LCK right now. I feel like they have pretty much cemented that with this result. We'll obviously see how the rest of the year goes, but Lehens has been an absolute monster. It feels like the rest of the team has just gotten better over the course of not only this split, but like significantly better in the offseason. Obviously, a lot of these players have leveled up. Nongshim is kind of turning into the best version of themselves, the version we were hoping we were going to see from this team, and that could be good enough to make some noise in the back half of this year, but unfortunately, they will be done here for this tournament. Gen.G is going to thank their lucky stars that they are moving on to the next round and they have avoided disaster. Things could have absolutely gone better, but I guess things could have gone worse for them as well. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Cup Winter Playoffs, whatever you want to call it, Round 3 overview and analysis video. Winners Finals is done. Lower bracket, the 3rd, 4th place matchup is done. We know our semifinals, our top 3 teams, and we know our 1 team to qualify for the Grand Finals in Hanwha Life Esports. Dplus Kia and Gen.G will, of course, be facing off later on in the week to determine who is going to be taking on Hanwha Life in the Grand Finals, and we'll quickly preview that here. But again, big ups to Nongshim. They gave absolutely everything they had in that series against Gen.G and just couldn't come out on top. Who do I think is going to win the semifinals, though? DK. Like, Gen.G needed to come out and dominate Nongshim for me to, like, even really believe in them at all. Right now, I don't believe this series is going to be all that close. I think Dplus Kia is on a completely different tier than Gen.G is right now. I honestly think Gen.G is, like, the clear-cut number 4 team in the LCK at the current moment, and Dplus Kia just barely lost to Hanwha Life and honestly could potentially turn that series around if they get another shot. I predict that they will be getting that other shot because I just think that they're better. The only way I could see Gen.G popping off and winning this series, honestly, in the form that they're in right now, is if Chovy just completely takes over. Now, if Canyon comes out and is really good against Lucid, which, honestly, newsflash, Lucid's really good into Canyon. It's actually been Lucid's best historical matchup in the LCK. Every single time he plays Canyon, he plays the best games he has. Not looking good on that front. Canyon's already out of form. If Duro can just survive, or if Ruler can come out and be, like, way better than aiming, like, theoretically, those things can happen, and Gen.G can get advantages in that front. I just don't expect that to happen. I think the middle of the map is going to be fine for DK. I think Lucid might even be a player to watch in terms of, like, a complete dominating type of series, and I think Showmaker is in a really good position to be able to capitalize on the fact that Chovy's going to have to do too much of the heavy lifting, and he's probably going to be more free to move around the rest of the map. I think Siwoo and Aiming and especially Beryl are going to be really open for business in terms of the aggressive plays. We already saw it with Lehens, with Nongshim taking advantage of that. I think Beryl could do even more. Like, honestly, I think DK just has everything going for them in this series, and that's why I'm predicting a 3-0. I don't think this is going to be close. Maybe Gen.G picks up a game because of Chovy. 3-1, I think, is a totally fair and valid prediction, but I don't think this series is going to be back and forth. I don't think it's going to be close. Right now, in terms of current form, DK should slaughter Gen.G, and that's kind of what I'm expecting. So we'll see if that ends up happening. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that take down in the comment section below. Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the final 2 series here in the LCK Cup, but we cover all 3 of the other major regions as well, so the LTA, the LEC, and the LPL. All of them are within their own playoffs right now, and so if you want playoff coverage of them, stick around on the channel. And of course, First Stand is coming right around the corner, and the winner of this tournament will be going to that. If you want coverage on everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all